I am Flavia Belliani Zimmerman from the Australian Institute of International Affairs in Western Australia, and today we have with us Professor Benjamin Reilly from the University of Western Australia, and we'll be discussing the return of democratic alliances. Thank you for being with us, Professor Reilly.
Hello, Flavia. Hello, everyone.
Professor Reilly, if you can please explain the leading factors driving the return of democratic alliances worldwide.
So, yes, it's an interesting phenomenon. Democratic alliances, of course, are part of our history. If you look at the First and Second World Wars, were won by alliances, not entirely alliances of democracies, but predominantly alliances of democracies. The Cold War was very much a period where the Western and mostly, again, not entirely, democratic world was facing the Soviet Union and its mostly, but not entirely, autocratic client states. So there's quite a history of democratic alliances. What I'm arguing in my talk for the AIIA today is that the last few years have seen, and really the last year or so in particular, have seen something of a rebirth of existing institutions being refashioned or rebranded or reconceptualized as alliances of democracies. So we've just had a G7 meeting in the UK a week or so ago. The G7 traditionally was not seen predominantly as a grouping of democracies. It was seen as a grouping of advanced economies, major economies. At one point, Russia was a member when it was the G8. But the G7 today is very explicitly branding itself as a grouping of democracies, liberal democracies, put out a statement on open societies, which is one of the most progressive, liberal democratic paeans I've seen in many a year. So there's the G7. NATO. Most people think of NATO as being a military alliance, again, with its origins in the Cold War, and it is. But these days, NATO is increasingly branding itself, again, as an alliance of democracies, an alliance to protect democracy, and an alliance based on democratic values. We've seen similar language from the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, especially since Matthias Cormann has assumed the role of Secretary General, where there is a really strong link in the rhetoric coming out of the OECD now between the existence of open, competitive, liberal markets, which has been its traditional focus, and open, liberal politics. And countries like Australia have been very enthusiastic supporters of this shift, at least rhetorically. Our Prime Minister has given several speeches on this topic, which again is rather new for an Australian Prime Minister to be talking, really vocally about liberal democracy. So it seemed to me something is going on here and we need to investigate it. So that's what my talk is about.
Thank you so much. And in your view, how effective is the US's new democratic alliances to contain China's power and influence in the Indo-Pacific region?
So China is clearly a major reason for this shift in both rhetoric and organizational, justification that's going on in the world. China's activities, its use of its powers to, as we've seen in Australia, to influence domestic politics in democracies, really to make sort of take advantage of the openness of democratic societies to fund politicians who may say things that are in China's interests. But it's not just China. Russia has been a very enthusiastic subverter of democracies. A lot of the misinformation that occurred in the United States in the lead up to Donald Trump's election came from Russia, was funded by Russia, and Russia has continued to bombard places such as Ukraine and others in its sphere of influence with high levels of social media disinformation and misinformation, just as China is doing in Taiwan and other places. So the rise of China and the more aggressive behaviour of Russia and the use of what the National Endowment for Democracy has termed sharp power, so not soft power, not smart power, sharp power, where tools of statecraft are used to try to undermine democratic societies, often to undermine the citizens' faith in their own democracies, to spread misinformation, to try and create division within those societies. And you would have to say in cases like the United States, they've been quite successful at doing that. They've really achieved a lot in a short period of time through the use, predominantly the use of social media misinformation, but there's lots of other things going on as well in terms of high tech, engineering standards, artificial intelligence, and so on. So these are the sort of parameters of this new emerging great game, maybe even a new emerging Cold War, that I'm arguing seems to be based predominantly on regime type rather than, you know, the other kinds of factors that might have predominated in the past.
Thank you so much, Professor Reilly. And how regional democratic alliances, such as the Quad, will impact the Indo-Pacific strategic architecture?
So there are these new, you couldn't call it Quad an alliance, but there are these new groupings, strategic communities, some cases just, you know, meetings, talk shops, talking opportunities springing up in various parts of the world. And the big one in Australia, as you suggest, Flavia, is the quadrilateral security dialogue between the United States and India and Australia. This has been around for about a decade. It sort of had a flowering pushed by former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. About a decade ago, Australia was involved and then a bit lukewarm. India was involved, but never that, you know, a bit lukewarm as well for different reasons. But in the last couple of years, again, because of China and China's aggressive behaviour in the South China Sea, China's aggression towards India, you know, there is an actual border dispute, and just the anxieties about the rise of China more generally, the quadrilateral security dialogue has assumed this new importance, new prominence. There was a leaders meeting quite recently, which is pretty unusual. Our foreign minister's been over in the US for Quad meetings, and it seems to be something that has, you know, a potential to group these four very different countries together. I mean, Australia, of course, has an alliance with the United States. We have a lot of interoperability with the United States. We have quite close relations with Japan, increasingly close, including some degree of military cooperation, but we don't have particularly close ties with India historically. So this is going to be an interesting experiment to see if this lasts. I think the really interesting thing about the Quad, and the thing that makes it a little bit different to some of the other organisations that I mentioned earlier, was that it spans cultures and civilizations, in that it brings together Western cultures, Asian cultures, very different Asian cultures in the case of Japan and India, you might almost think of it as bringing together different civilizations. And I think that's quite important, because one of the critiques of this re-emergence of democratic alliances that has been made by China and by commentators and academics is that it looks a lot like the old Western club, and in some cases looks like an Anglophone club. So the Quad is important in that sense, because it's clearly neither Western nor Anglophone. It bridges cultures and civilizations.
Thank you so much. So in more specific terms, do you think eventually the Quad, because of its strategic importance, it could eventually evolve into an alliance? Do you think it could happen?
I don't know. I mean, when you talk about an alliance, capital A alliance, like the sort of alliance between Australia and the United States, you're making pretty serious commitments to each other. You're making a commitment that if one party goes to war, the other party should be there too. I doubt if, Japan and India, or even Australia and India, are going to evolve into that kind of relationship. So it's not clear what the Quad will evolve into. It may become more a forum for coordinating on soft power, or a lot of the discussion at the last Quad meeting was about the COVID situation and vaccines and so on, rather than a hard, military capital A alliance. But I think it's still important, and it certainly attracted a lot of attention from scholars in Australia, a lot of international relations scholars in the first incarnation of the Quad were quite dismissive of it. But I think those views have shifted a lot, and many people now see a value in 4 of the larger, and Australia's by far the smallest of the Quad countries, but 4 of the larger democracies with some military capacity, very large military capacity in the case of the United States, joining together. If for no other reason that it sends a pretty clear signal to others, such as China, about the possibility that in the future there may be more serious collaboration, and the future is always unknown. So I think that signal is quite a useful one.
Thank you so much. And now, wrapping up our interview, if you can please explain how the new democratic alliances might reshape Australia's foreign policy and strategic posturing in the Indo-Pacific.
Well, I'll talk about this in my talk tonight, but I think this is a bit of a problem for Australia. I think actually it's not going to reshape the way we act that much. And there are already a couple of examples where, despite our very enthusiastic adoption of this rhetoric on the importance of democracy and of human rights and freedoms, and our willingness to stand with other democracies and our shared values, when it comes to a very obvious situation like what's just happened in Myanmar recently, actually Australia is not following through on its rhetoric. We're not doing anything. We're not even taking the small steps in terms of sanctions on the military that our partners like the United States and the United Kingdom and European countries are taking. So you would have to say there's a bit of a gap between our rhetoric and our actual behaviour. When it comes to Myanmar, I don't see any evidence that Australia is about to become a kind of liberal internationalist actor in Asia, trying to actively, promote democracy. We're not. If we were, we would be taking action in cases like Myanmar. We would be not only talking about China, we'd be talking about all the other autocracies. From Vietnam, there's all sorts of different autocracies in Asia these days. There's other communist systems, there's one-party states, there's military juntas. you know, there's absolute monarchies, there's all sorts of opportunities, if we were serious, to say, look, these political systems are not in line with our values. I don't think we're going to do that at all. So I think this is a bit of an issue, that we are talking the talk, but it's not clear we're going to walk the walk.
Thank you so much. Fascinating talk. And thank you for being with us. And for more information, please visit our website, www.internationalaffairs.org.au. Thank you.
Thank you, Flavia.